Well, it seems the survival instinct of both Oregon State and Washington State is coming out. You know, when there's an animal and they're limping and they've got about 3 breaths left. That's what's going on with this situation right now. Oregon State and Washington State are taking the Pac-12 to court in order to clarify voting rights and the control over assets. This was something that I discussed a week ago last Saturday, that Oregon State and Washington State, they don't have much left. And you have to understand, when it comes to these two teams, they're trying to keep anything they possibly can. This is a horrible situation for them, especially for Oregon State, who approved their big time, right around $200 million stadium renovation before any of this went down back in 2020. The idea for both of these teams were, while yes, they're not the most attractive schools, you've got conferences that have teams like Rutgers, Boston College, they're still getting their money. So Oregon State and Washington State thought, look, conference realignment happens with the SEC getting 2 teams. Nothing else is going to happen. That's going to be it. We're going to have USC. We're going to have UCLA. We're going to go into the next negotiating window, and we're going to get at least minimum. The Pac-12 was thinking $60 million per year, because remember, even after the Pac-12 lost USC and UCLA, they still said, we want $50 million. That's our starting price per year. Now you see the Pac-12 completely dissolve, and Washington State and Oregon State go from back in just 2019 and 2020 thinking their next TV deal would net them around $60 million per year. Now, if they join the Mountain West, they're going to be getting $6 million per year. Both of these teams, there's no other way to say it, they've gotten screwed. It's like the train is coming and they got run over, because really they're not attractive. And this is the same type of situation that would happen if other conferences dissolved. You would see the bottom teams in other conferences really struggle. Even though right now they're getting all this money, that's just because they're a part of a conference, and it's happening to Oregon State and Washington State. The key stuff here, according to the Pac-12 Constitution and bylaws, if a school member gives notice of withdrawal, they automatically cease to be a member of the Pac-12 Board of Directors. Therefore, Oregon State and Washington State now constitute the entire membership of the Pac-12 Board of Directors. Oregon State and Washington State brought this action against the conference and the commissioner. They are suing the commissioner and the Pac-12. The filing seeks to prevent the Pac-12 from permitting the departing members of the Pac-12 Board of Directors from meeting and attempting to take any action regarding the status or governance of the conference. And so that's the whole idea of completely dissolving the conference. Oregon State and Washington State, because there is technically, and we've got a tweet right here, a 2-year grace period in the wake of their lawsuit. Oregon State officials are saying that they want to rebuild the Pac-12. Now, we all know how ridiculous that is, and Oregon State officials know how ridiculous that is. But, if there is a legal workaround they can get to, this is just Oregon State as an organism on its last dying breath, fighting and clawing. It's the survival instinct of a university, and it is so interesting to see it play out. Protected by a 2-year NCAA grace period, Oregon State and Washington State's future depends on clarity of the Pac-12 assets and liabilities. The idea is, if all of these other teams leave the conference, does that 2-year grace period technically go into effect, where it could be a 2-team conference? And it's like, oh, we could rebuild it. Or there's been reports that Oregon State and Washington State, they're so pissed off. They want this money so bad. They want the Rose Bowl share, the playoff share of being a Power 5 league. They could say, look, we're just going to have a 2-team league. Now, I'll be honest, that cannot happen. There's going to have to be some type of settlement or legal stuff figured out to where that's not a thing. But this is the last leverage that Oregon State and Washington State have. And you can see just how dire of a situation this is. Oregon State did not create or seek these circumstances that led to today's legal action, but we are prepared to act swiftly to protect the legacy and the future viability of the Pac-12. Here is why I'm still fighting for the Pac-12. And the reason that they're fighting is because of money. They want money, and it makes complete sense. Again, I've outlined this entire thing. When you think just 3 or 4 years ago that you're getting $60 million per year, maybe not $60 million, but if USC was still in the Pac-12, they would get a good amount of money because that conference is more valuable. USC's a lot better right now with Lincoln Riley. You've got the 10:30 Eastern window, the fourth window, whatever you want to call it. And that's a conference that would do very well. Maybe it would be 50 million, whatever. But now you're de facto down to 6 million per year. If you join the Mountain West, maybe you're able to go to the negotiating table in 2026 and work something out. It is interesting that the Mountain West is going to have to negotiate a new TV deal in 2026 in just 3 years' time. Because you have Oregon State and Washington State, could they just say, we're just going to use this 2-year grace period, collect as much money as humanly possible? Because last week it was explained that because technically the Pac-12 still exists, and according to NCAA bylaws, it can exist for 2 years even with less than 8 teams, which is ridiculous. There has to be some type of legal action to where you can say, no, this is just impossible. You cannot be a conference. Honestly, if there's less than 10 teams at this point, you probably shouldn't be a conference, but less than 6 teams, it's a joke. So you would think there would be something written in the laws that would protect from a situation like this happening, to where if you get below a certain teams, there's no bylaw that can protect you and give you a 2-year grace period. I guess they could say, oh, this is us rebuilding the Pac-12 by adding a bunch of Mountain West schools, but we all know that's just basically Oregon State and Washington State joining the Mountain West. There's also the idea they could try and do something where they would lure both Mountain West teams, the best teams from the Mountain West and the best teams from the American. The issue with that would be the buyout for the American. The American just recently signed a new TV deal, and it's got those teams latched in through, I want to say 2031 or 2032, meaning because it might actually be 2033. Those teams would have to pay a big buyout. Now, if they can somehow swing this and keep their Power 5 status, maybe those teams in the American would consider paying it. But you would have to think that at some point they're going to have to strip the Pac-12 of Power 5 status. And the reason that's so important is because they don't get any money from the Rose Bowl. They don't get any money from the playoff and all the other stuff that comes along with it. So it is very important. That's why Oregon State and Washington State are doing this kind of clown show. They're trying to fight. They're trying to use whatever leverage they have of being de facto screwed, right? Because, again, this could happen with any conference. There's always a bottom team in every conference that's not wanted. It just happened with the Pac-12, and it's hurting these two teams. And really, I mean, we all know how ridiculous realignment has gotten, but it reached another level with Stanford and Cal joining the ACC, to where there's no other West Coast. I mean, you could say SMU, but SMU in Texas versus California, it is pretty ridiculous. But you've got Stanford and Cal. That just shows you how much of a dire situation it is. And then it says, as the two remaining members of the conference and in accordance with conference bylaws, Oregon State and Washington State believe that we constitute the voting membership of the Pac-12 board in its entirety, not the members who are leaving it. That's why earlier today we filed a motion in court, and that just says the exact same thing. So they're trying to make sure them and Washington State are the only members of the conference, which would keep the conference alive for 2 more years. If you have all the teams leaving voting on this, the conference would dissolve entirely. They would, not vote to keep it together. There's no reason for the other teams to want to keep the Pac-12 together, but this at some point needs to be worked out. And it seems like a last-ditch effort by Oregon State and Washington State to make more money over these next 2 years. Again, would they bring teams in from the Mountain West? Would they be a 2-team conference? It just seems all ridiculous. Imagine that The Pac-12 keeps their auto bid to the Rose Bowl. Not that it matters anymore, though, because the Rose Bowl is just going to be part of the playoff rotation with the playoff expanding to 12 teams. But imagine if the playoff was 4 teams and it would have to be either Washington State or Oregon State going to the Rose Bowl for the next 2 years. They get an auto bid to it. They're like 6-6 and they make the Rose Bowl. What if they were 4-8? Would they let them in? I don't know. They wouldn't even be able to make a bowl game, but they'd be able to go to the Rose Bowl. But that's just something funny. Either way, this is not happening. There's no way. This has got to be some type of leverage move to try and work out a settlement and get some type of money for them getting screwed. And maybe if the NCAA and some of these maybe if there are enough laws that, protect something like this from happening, maybe Oregon State and Washington State just get nothing. And they're just forced to join the Mountain West. I mean, that could happen too. We don't know the exact laws when it comes to the idea of a 2-year grace period if your conference has under 8 members. Also, you would have to think this conference it's dissolved. It doesn't exist anymore. But, because Washington State and Oregon State have gotten screwed, they're trying to use whatever they can. And guys, when it comes to realignment, just a big picture thing, because I don't think we're going to be... The realignment, you would figure, it's over for the foreseeable future. Like the next 5 or 6 months, there's going to be no realignment stuff because of the games and stuff like that. But I would say next year definitely is when you're going to get, it's going to be the summer of Florida State and Clemson. Honestly, it is interesting with Clemson. What if Clemson has a bad season? Because you got to think Clemson really, while certainly they've gained a lot of popularity, they are not a big university, so that'll be interesting if Clemson ends up really falling, and I don't think they will. I think Clemson will go like 10-3 this year. They'll turn it around, but it is something interesting. We think Clemson is this team that's wanted by every conference, and if it'll be interesting to see if they struggle. I don't think they will. I still think Clemson and FSU will be headed to the SEC. I don't see any scenario where those teams go to the Big Ten because I don't think ESPN's going to give up their rights. If ESPN has to facilitate something to keep the rights of FSU and Clemson, they're going to do it. They're not going to let FSU and Clemson go to the Big Ten unless FSU gets like Saudi money to where they're able to pay a ridiculous buyout and leave that horrible grant of rights and then go to the Big Ten. The Big Ten, I'm sure, would want FSU. They want a team based in Florida. We know that. But I would expect it next year. It's going to be all Clemson. It's going to be FSU. It's going to be what does Washington State, Oregon State end up doing. This is all going to get worked out. And then it's what is the SEC response now that the Big Ten is up to 18 teams, the SEC is at 16 teams. You would figure they would want to do something, and the SEC does want to stay in that southern footprint, which would work out perfectly for both Clemson and FSU based on where they're located. You also have the idea that Florida would try and block Florida State from joining the SEC. I don't buy that at all. That's something that'll get worked out. Maybe they'll coax them or something, but I highly doubt Florida will stand in the way of that. And even if they do, it'll end up getting worked out, and they'll probably be in the conference, and it won't be that big of a deal. But Washington State, Oregon State, they have a survival instinct here. They're trying to use whatever leverage they have because technically this conference, I guess, is still alive unless there's some type of law written within the NCAA that says at a certain point you cannot exist as a conference. And if your conference gets crushed, the idea that you're going to rebuild it using a bunch of group of 5 teams is ridiculous. When you've got 10 teams in a conference and 8 of them are group of 5, that's not a Power 5 conference just because 2 teams rebuilt it. That's a group of 5 conference, right? Because 8 of the teams are group of 5. And then even the 2 Power 5 teams, Washington State and Oregon State, these teams are not powerhouses, folks. Let's just call it what it is. Although I do like Oregon State this year a lot. They've got their brand new stadium renovation. They just won. They crushed San Jose State. So we will see when it comes to that. But either way, guys, that is going to do it for this video. Make sure you're following me on X. Link to that's always in the description.